Welcome back and thank you for joining A Shark's Perspective. Do you feel that your customers are entitled? Are you entitled as a customer yourself? Are you competing against brands today that have raised the bar to a level too high and you want to know how to compete with those who are best in providing that experience? Dave Frankland is the CEO at Customer Strategy Architects, a speaker, and the co-author of Marketing to the Entitled Consumer: How to Turn Unreasonable Expectations into Lasting Relationships. And on this episode, we'll discuss the changing habits of consumers, how some brands have elevated their customer experience to what you must emulate. And there is also a special chance to win an autographed copy of the book from the author. Just listen to the show and you'll hear how to enter. So let's tune in to an entitled co-author with an entitled shark on this episode of A Shark's Perspective. Dave, thank you so much for joining me today on A Shark's Perspective. So what's your background? Tell us a little bit about your career to date in a nutshell.
Sure, thanks, Kenneth, and excited to be here and appreciate the opportunity.
Absolutely.
So I'm a strategy consultant. I focus on helping companies build better customer strategies and deeper customer relationships, and then also help technology marketing and experience vendors with their business strategies. My career hasn't exactly been linear, which allows me to bring some different perspectives to bear. Most recently, I was Chief Strategy Officer of Selligent Marketing Cloud, and before that I spent several years at Forrester Research, first as an analyst covering the database services and agency markets, and then as research director, I co-founded the Customer Intelligence Research Group and led that. And I started my career in PR and corporate communications with agencies and in-house at DoubleClick. So I sort of bring those different perspectives to bear and apply those skills from communications and messaging to research to strategy whenever I'm consulting with companies or thinking about trends in the market.
So we're here today to talk about your book that you co-authored with Nick Worth. And, basically after speaking at a conference, I was returning home and walking through a major airport that had surprisingly very well-stocked shelves of books, including marketing books, which is rare in and of itself. I mean, usually all you generally get is a general leadership stuff, and maybe you can see a Fast Company or a Success magazine, out of the corner of your eye. But I was looking at some of the bestsellers that I had read and recognized and saw the artwork with your book, with the meter, with the happy to sad emojis on it, and I had to take a look at the rest. And so your book is Marketing to the Entitled Consumer: How to Turn Unreasonable Expectations into Lasting Relationships. And I will tell you that I bought it, read it, and thoroughly enjoyed it. So, other than me typically being a very angered entitled consumer, what inspired you to write this book and with your partner?
Yeah, so Nick and I had been having this sort of ongoing conversation for a couple of years about the fact that it's harder now than ever to build and form those durable relationships with customers, and it's for a number of reasons: customer expectations, customer empowerment, consumer technology, the information that consumers have at their fingertips, and we'd also been spending a lot of time thinking about the millennial and Gen Z generations and the impact that they're having on how marketers need to engage with them. And one day we were listening to an author at a customer conference, and we'd had a conversation at dinner that I'll come on to the night before, and we just looked at each other when this guy was speaking and sort of said, we need to crystallize all this and put it in a book. And so the night before that story was one of our colleagues was complaining about the icon on a phone screen when you order an Uber, that it can actually be a block or two away in real life versus where the phone is in reality, and how frustrating it is. And we were all nodding and saying how crazy it is. And then somebody just sort of said, who the hell do we think we are? That if 5 years ago somebody had said to us, pull out your phone, tap it about 3 times, a car is going to show up. You don't even need to speak to the driver. You don't have to take your wallet out of your pocket. You can be in a foreign country, not speak the language, you name it. And it'll get you exactly where you need to go, probably at a lower cost and at least the same speed as any other mode of transport. But wait, the picture on the screen might not be exactly where the car is in real life. We would obviously have jumped at that as an opportunity. And,
Sure.
and it sort of came to us that we had been talking about millennials as entitled, and it was this sort of light bulb moment that we're all entitled. And we've got hundreds of these examples.
Oh, yeah.
if you've ever complained about the speed of Wi-Fi on an airplane,
Yeah.
you're entitled. If you've ever chosen not to buy something from a website because the delivery was going to be more than 2 days or it wasn't free, you're entitled. If you've wondered why it takes so long for your chip-based credit card transaction to clear, that extra 4 seconds, we're entitled. And like I said, there's hundreds of these.
Oh,
And
yeah.
it was really fascinating when we explained this. We interviewed about 90 people for the book,
Wow.
in addition to the consumer research we did. And when we would sort of describe that, it was fascinating that everybody would give us their own anecdote back.
Sure.
Somebody would sort of say, when I order my Starbucks and it tells me it's going to take 7 minutes, if it takes 8 minutes, I'm angry, and all those types of things. And so it was this big, like I say, a light bulb moment where we realized that every single one of us is entitled, although the research shows us that actually 68% of us are entitled.
Yeah, well, that sounds like somebody that's obviously never hailed a cab in Midtown during rush hour too. So that,
Or a class.
yeah, exactly. Well, and it also sounds like a Jeff Foxworthy skit almost. You're a redneck if, I mean, you
Yeah.
can, if you're entitled if that you may have a whole other play with that. Then how do you specifically define what an entitled consumer is in today's world? I mean, how are the consumers looking at brands today with their expectations?
Yeah, so there's two ways I would sort of think about it, and let me give you the one that we used before we have research, and then I'll give you the research answer. And
Sure.
so we used to sort of say, and there's various definitions of entitlement, but we sort of shorthand it as it's people who believe that they are deserving of special treatment or privilege, and we're very quick to sort of say that there's it's almost deliberately provocative to talk about an entitled consumer, but we think it's an opportunity. We're not blaming or criticizing consumers. Our whole sort of mantra and the reason for the book is rather than trying to swim against this type of entitlement, swim with it and embrace it and adjust what we do as
100%.
marketers to bring these people in and show them that you're giving them special treatment and privilege. Flip side of that is so for the book, we did research with 7,000 consumers, 2,000 in the U.S. and 1,000 each in 5 Western European countries. And we did focus groups in 4 countries. And then, as I said, we did somewhere between 80 and 90 interviews with practitioners and marketers and other experts. And we basically, from that research, boiled it down to 2 dimensions of entitlement. And they're similar but slightly different. And we refer to them as hard entitlement. That manifests itself in people making demands. And so that could mean them expecting control over how a company engages with them, all the way through to them expecting discounts for poor service. Soft entitlement is different, and it's reflected in people who are willing to share data, for example, to get better service, and sort of expect customers to understand their needs, and they anticipate better service. And so we sort of divided up that population into 4 segments. So if you visualize it 2 by 2, those that don't show neither soft nor hard, we call indifferent. Those that show only hard entitlement, we call demanders. Those that show only soft, we call anticipators. And those that show both hard and soft, we call fully entitled. And as I mentioned earlier, we found that in the U.S., 68% of U.S. consumers to be entitled in some way and 28% to be fully entitled. And it differed a little bit across each of those geographies, but not significantly. And the other thing I would just highlight that was probably the biggest surprise was that the segments didn't map to traditional customer segmentation. So,
Right. That was what I was just about to ask.
okay, yeah, it was really interesting. There wasn't sort of spikes of age or income or whether they were urban or rural, gender,
Gender,
education
race,
level.
sure.
It didn't really matter. There's sort of somewhere between 2/3 and 3/4 of us that are entitled in some shape or form. And so our point in the book is, there isn't an easy way necessarily to identify them unless you really go down this road. And we'd almost say, don't waste your efforts on going down the road to identify who's entitled and just treat everybody as entitled, because
Absolutely.
the other is we think that it's a moving tide that will grow, because we think that it's one of those things that just our baseline expectation keeps on rising based on the experiences we have with other companies.
But did it skew more with any one of those, you know, typical demographic data points? I mean, did it skew a little more, or where did it skew the most with that data? I mean,
But really,
did it
that
skew
was the
especially
point. It
with
really
age?
No, it really didn't. I mean, we expected that coming in. Again, we sort of had our part of our whole initial conversation around this was millennial and Gen Z, and yet when we got into it, and thankfully we had somebody that understands statistics at a much greater level than I do,
Sure.
and we dug at it because it was sort of counterintuitive, but it was just that it was almost universal, and
Yeah.
as a it's interesting that you and I already have spoken about ways in which we are entitled. Every interview I did was with a fairly seasoned um, marketer or practitioner, expert, and everybody's nodding as you say it. And so I think sometimes that manifestation might differ, which we didn't get into in this research. It could be good follow up to sort of say, well, um, is there something different about how a younger generation manifests itself? It may be more technologically driven or whatnot, but the idea of entitlement in general was fairly universal.
Well, I think it's also interesting to see, this is another conversation for another day, but I recently had a podcast interview with a gentleman who pointed out that, especially with millennials, are starting to enter the C suite. And I think it's going to be really interesting over time to see how the C suite within a brand, really embraces this change instead of whereas typical brands have, middle age, baby boomers, and so on and so forth. It's going to be interesting to see how that future, which we'll talk about later. Personally, I think that's going to be an interesting mix of how the millennial generation looks at their own generation and services them. So great. Well, let's dive in then a little further. And you write about the pace of entitlement accelerating. And I agree with that completely. I think each year it seems to, figuratively in my head, double in speed. But elaborate, if you will, on that point, please, about how entitlement is accelerating in today's world.
Yeah. So what our belief is that our as consumers our expectations rise based on our best experiences, and that's regardless of the company or the industry where we had that experience. And
Mm-hmm.
so we're sort of living in this age of an experience arms race. And that leads to this notion of what we call in the book the transference of entitlement. And that means that every company is competing on an experience baseline
Mm-hmm.
set by companies like Amazon and Disney and USAA and Apple, which means that just because, for example, you've always had to wait on hold to speak to your cable company, doesn't mean that you'll be willing to accept it anymore. Amazon has taught us to expect 2-day free shipping, and we expect it now from any company. USAA, they were the first company, for example, to introduce depositing checks through your cell phone. They did it because a lot of their members, as they call
Right.
them,
The military.
are in the military. Yeah, and so you receive a check, you're not necessarily close to a bank. It was a convenience,
Yeah.
but then every other bank had to follow. And they do this. There's hundreds of USAA examples during the government shutdown.
Mm-hmm.
You start to question why isn't every company suspending overdraft and late payment fees the way USAA did? So, company does something, and it raises the baseline of what we expect from every other company, and it's no longer comparing. I've been saying this for several years now that you don't compete only with the companies in your category. You compete with Nordstrom on service, Amazon on convenience, Apple on design,
Such a great
Disney on
point. Yeah.
overall experience, etc.
Yeah, they have raised the bar way beyond just their verticals, and I couldn't agree with you more about USA. It's a great company. So part of this as well, obviously, a point of influence in this whole puzzle is the marketing department, and you
Mm-hmm.
speak about the marketing overload that a lot of marketers are feeling. What is that, in your opinion, and how do the modern marketers combat that?
So I had this experience several years ago where I was walking through on my way to a conference and walking through Las Vegas airport, and it was just this assault on the senses. It was didn't matter what time of day or night it was lit up with just it felt like millions, but it was probably hundreds of messages. And you wonder how you expect any individual walking through that airport to sort of absorb any single one of those.
Mm-hmm.
We write in the book about the tragedy of the commons. A story where if everyone adds one more, just one more cow to the shared commons, it's only one more cow each. But quickly you're going to destroy the commons that you're all benefiting from. And we've reached that saturation point whereby if something isn't relevant and isn't something that's welcomed and valuable, it's now negative. It's no longer neutral if it's a miss. It's negative. You had Jay Baer on a few weeks ago, and he was talking about relevance as the killer app. We couldn't agree more. It's one of our chapters is all about relevance. And unfortunately, today, most of what we're getting is still it's either irrelevant or there's a lack of respect, right? So it's that retargeted ad that follows me everywhere I go, even though I may already have actually bought that product or whatever else. And so that's the struggle we see is consumers just completely overwhelmed, and it's largely driven by starting from the marketer's point of view. And so we make this call in the book to shift to a consumer-first approach to marketing rather than a marketing or brand-centric approach to marketing.
Yeah. You went on in that same chapter on marketing overload to talk about the conflict of marketing versus customer experience. And customer experience is such a hot topic in conferences and books and with speakers today and so on in today's climate. But, I always define it as lipstick on a pig when the product or service is still horrible. I've worked with brands that have been that way, and yet they pour everything they can into marketing and advertising to try to fix it, and it still leaves you with a horrible experience. And marketing does what they can to put out branded messaging, but that so often conflicts and really irritates, the customer in today's world. So what did you mean by the conflict of marketing versus customer experience?
Yeah, so I think, and I mentioned that I worked at Forrester and worked closely with several colleagues who were in the customer experience practice at Forrester, and I actually I was the MC for a customer experience forum that we hosted in London at one point.
Mm-hmm.
And I had this great conversation on stage with a gentleman from Emirates Airlines, and we were talking about their approach to customer experience, and they had former colleagues of mine were in a book called Outside In. And Emirates had this outside-in approach, putting the customer at the center. They had this visual customer journey map that you literally could walk along. And their thing was they had employees that spoke over 100 languages, and so doing it in a visual way meant everyone was interpreting the same thing. And one of my favorite examples was when he talked about the bartender in their first class lounge. I'm sorry, on the airplane, they have a bar in the first class area, and if that person hears a complaint or a comment, part of their job is to capture that information and pass it on, because so many of their passengers are flying two legs.
Yeah.
So your job, if you hear something on the first leg, is to make sure that if it's an issue that could get resolved on the second leg, that information gets passed on. So, I was fascinated by all of this from an experience and a journey mapping point of view. And then I asked him, I come at it more from the traditional database lens. And I sort of said to him, so how does that relate down to the customer? Can you tie that in with the customer value, for example, or making sure that you're giving more perspective to more emphasis to one person than another? And he was like, that's so far from, it's where we want to get to, but it's so far from where we are. Right now we're trying to treat the biggest problems that we can solve that will benefit the biggest number of people. But we could be solving problems that are problems for our least valuable customers, and we don't know. And so that's where I sort of see this like conflict between marketing and customer experience. I think if you look at modern marketing, database marketing, and sort of, we could spend a whole other podcast talking about that data side of the world. But once you understand customers down at that sort of individual level and marry that up to trying to deliver a better customer experience, that conflict goes away. Right now, those two things are on, if not quite parallel, they're definitely on separate paths.
Well, what did the data tell you, or were you able to look at it to see where these consumers in today's world were irritated the most? I mean, you talked about the mapping briefly, but was there any particular hot point within the typical customer experience that, not that it would matter, because anytime you're irritated, it always is an irritation, but at least a lot of times brands can make up on the back end and fix something that they've messed up. But
Yeah.
was there any kind of time point that you were able to see within overall, or if you didn't,
Not
not
not really, and we sort of we tried to think about how we could do it
right.
in survey form, and it felt like it was going to be way too generic to do at
Sure.
that level. So we did get into it in some of the focus groups, and then it was like every other conversation. It was the two extremes. You got the praise for Amazon and Tesco and whatever, and the complaints about Ryanair and whomever else,
Mm-hmm.
and sort of
Mm-hmm.
one person talked about Booking.com, and so it was very specific examples that we just didn't know how to capture that at that sort of macro level. Um, but but and I think that's part of the challenge for companies is you can't take
Absolutely.
this up. Right? You've got to go out and look at your own customers and understand those. But we got mentions of Pinterest and Xfinity, to Vistaprint, and you name it. There was hundreds of companies mentioned in those focus groups that were some were positive, some were negative.
Well, one of the things I always find extremely interesting about customer experience, and you can have somebody ruin it at any point from A to Z along the journey. I mean, that's happened to me. I don't know how many times, to where, I had some appliances that I bought, and the company, a well-known brand across the country, had a great experience all the way through up until when they did the installation. And even though it was contractors, I believe, that they hired, it still ruined a lot of the experience. And not that there was any necessarily amount of entitlement, but it made me realize how much a brand could do 99% of it right, and 1% of it just blow
Sure.
it, and blows it, as your
Yes,
thought for the brand.
I sometimes quote another former colleague who's still at Forrester, Fatima Catablu. She writes a lot about privacy and
Mm-hmm.
personal identity, and one of her quotes in relation to that realm, I think, is equally true in as it relates to customer experience, and that is she's writing about trust. She says that trust is earned in drops and lost in
Yeah,
bucketfuls,
exactly.
and I think that's true of customer experience too. The positive notion of customer experience. It's only when you get that overwhelming aha moment that you notice customer experience. It's when something goes really well or really poorly. All that sort of 95% in the middle, we don't really notice until it peaks on one of those extremes.
Yeah, another interesting thing that I find with a lot of brands, yeah, USA is great, USAA is great, Amazon is great. A lot of these companies that you've mentioned, they're great brands. They provide overall a great experience. But it's very interesting that there are a lot of brands who aren't considered to have a great customer experience yet. It's because of one thing that stands out in that journey, if you will, that really blows it up for them. I mean, people that have, some of the cable TV or satellite TV services, uh, they're great services. But if you want to talk about what ruins the experience, is having to sit on hold and call,
Mm-hmm.
DirecTV
Yep.
or Dish or any of those, and then you get a
Or
call
take a day
center.
off work to stay home.
Exactly.
Yep.
Yeah, for waiting for somebody, and you could thoroughly enjoy every bit of it, but you have that part of the customer experience that makes you want to switch to, Roku or Hulu or whoever
Mm.
it is, Apple TV, whatever it is. So, what's your point of view, at least then, on small brands versus large brands? We've talked about a lot of large brands that stand out, that have a great or a negative experience associated with their brand names, but that's often because they're large brands and they're not nimble.
Mm-hmm.
They can't fix things easily, that they've messed up. But what kind of advice do you give these smaller brands, or how do you look at the smaller brands and how they can help work with the entitled consumers today, since they typically are more nimble, and they're generally the ones that, as they're coming up, and emerging, it's based off of some really great customer experience, like you hear with a Lululemon or something like that.
Yeah. So, not knowing how the rest of today's interview is going to go, I'm going to say that this could be the most important conversation we have in response to this question. And I say that because I think the size of company and the industry you're in and all these other elements are, to a large extent, irrelevant, and in some respects are an excuse and a crutch that companies use to not attempt to do anything. So let me give a couple of examples real quick. So about 5-ish years ago, maybe it was more than that. Now that I think about it, Disney invested $1 billion in what they referred to as next generation experience, and I was very privileged at the time to have an insider's view, and I used to talk very frequently and go to visit Tom Boyles, who was running what they called customer managed relationships at the time. And Tom would talk about. He would sort of stop at points and say, people say this is easy for me because I have assets like Mickey Mouse and Johnny Depp, and he's got such an emotional connection to people that we can do all this fairly easy.
Mm-hmm.
But he would say, I grew up in financial services, and tell me what's more emotionally important than the roof over your family's head.
Mm-hmm.
And he'd sort of say, that's your mortgage, or your retirement, that's
Mm-hmm.
your 401k, or your children's education, or your. And he says, it's not about the assets I have, it's about the mindset I have.
Mm-hmm.
And so you look at how that parlays in Disney, and it's every single element. It goes back to Walt Disney himself, who got upset when he saw somebody from the Tomorrowland walking through Frontierland,
Mm-hmm.
and it broke that disbelief kind of thing. And so they built a whole underground tunnel system so that it would keep the illusion going for children. But you look at little examples that cost nothing, where a security guard, we write about this in the book, where a security guard will get down on one knee and ask girls that are arriving at the parks dressed up as princesses for their autograph. And those parents, when the kids go home, will tell you that all the money they spent on a huge Disney vacation and all the rides and all the character breakfasts, but the thing that stood out to them was that this Disney employee thought they were a real princess. There's videos, if you go on YouTube now, of custodians that are cleaning in Disney, taking
Sure.
out their brush and drawing Mickey Mouse with a wet brush. And you go to L.A. or Orlando, those things don't last long. It's there. 2 kids get a benefit from that, or 4 kids, whatever it is,
Mm-hmm.
and it goes away. But it's a mindset. It's about delivering something that is just all-encompassing to wanting you to have the best experience. Another little anecdote. Then again, so that's on the one side a company of the size of Disney. But you can do this no matter what your size.
Agreed.
If you think about what is it that's going to deliver value to the customer, and is there something I can do that's big or small? And our advice is always start small. You don't need to do all this at once, but start to change the mindset first, and then everything else follows.
Then describe, if you will, you talk a little bit about the omni-channel view to the consumer, and how we should take advantage of that as marketers. What's your viewpoint on that? And did you give any specific advice on specific channel type strategies?
Yeah, so we have a whole chapter on omnichannel,
Mm-hmm.
and what I would say, one important thing I just mentioned is we think about data and omnichannel engagement or experience as sort of a yin yang. We even include it in the book as a diagram, and we do that because it's similar to that whole notion of Taoist philosophy. Data and omnichannel are interconnected and interdependent. What I mean by that is that every engagement with a consumer is an opportunity to show them how much you already know and to use that to deliver value to them. But it's also a learning opportunity. It's an opportunity to bring information back in. And so the omnichannel conversation quickly goes to sort of technology and process for sort of having that continuous and evolving conversation with a customer. Again, from a mindset point of view, we would add sort of on their terms whenever they choose to engage, etc. But it's sort of, different people will describe it in different ways, whether it's surround sound, but it's not having that disjointed conversation where I'm on the website. I've got to stage X of a process. I call the call center and have to start all over again, or I go into the store and I have to start all over again. It's trying to sort of, as I say, sort of have that evolving conversation again, we go back to the better, positive customer experience than when you have that sort of feels like I'm working with 6 different companies, even though I'm trying to get to the same outcome.
All right. So you talk a little bit about relationships, and if you have a entitled customer, and I promise whatever the brand is you do, then what are the pieces of it? What do we need to do in order to start forging better relationships with these consumers so that we can keep them as customers for a long time?
So we break it down across what we call the 3 R's: reciprocal value, relevance, and respectful empathy. And each of those has a host of information in there. There's an excuse to go and read the book. But within value, it can be everything from understanding and solving the customer's broader problem. So we use the example, for example, of Surefoot, company that makes ski boots for kids, and the fact that kids grow out of them so quickly, and they created this program that allows you to continually change them. But it's thinking about what's that value as a parent that I'm looking for, or in there we sort of include things like aligning your company with your customers' values. We point to companies like Patagonia and Tom's, encouraging random acts of kindness, which often falls into the customer experience conversation. So lots of examples in there, just around reciprocal value. So it goes back to the conversation we were having about understanding what's the customer trying to get out of this relationship, and finding profitable ways to deliver that to them. Relevance is relatively straightforward. Again, we mentioned Jay Bayer's comment about it being the killer app earlier. One of our stories in the book is about Kinopolis, which is a Belgian movie theater company. And in some of their email campaigns, they actually only send messages to 7% of their customer base, because they've figured out, they sort of refer to their job as marketing as a service.
Yeah.
And they figured out what's relevant to whom, and have the discipline, most importantly, to follow through on that. And so, and then consumers, they do surveys, and like 65-70% of consumers say their messaging is either good or perfect, kind of thing. And our other author on this book, another former colleague of mine, Josh Burnoff, he's written a book called Writing Without Bullshit. And one of Josh's mantras is to treat your reader's time as more important or more valuable than your own. And I think relevance is similar. If you're treating your customer's time as more important than your own, it comes back to that mindset change that we were just talking about in that Disney example. There's other examples like using all the information you have, and then using information that's easy to get. So one of my favorite examples is Allstate Insurance that created a service called Good Home, a website that you go to looking for information about areas and that, and it'll detect where you live, ask you to confirm it, and then it pre-populates with known information. So it's in a very sort of friendly way. It's not freaking you out with creepy data. It's sort of saying,
Sure.
we're detecting you're here. If so, then it can pull in data from everything from Google to fire theft data, school information, whatever it might be, that just isn't asking. Historically, you were asked to input all this data so they could give you quotes and whatnot. And then under the respectful empathy side of things, hugely important. One of these elements is transparency, and I often point to the Guardian newspaper, which has written a lot about privacy and sort of walks the walk in terms of probably one of the best privacy pages, not just policies. Very clear and transparent about what information they collect, why they do it, how you can opt out of it, etc. Restraint. I just mentioned Kinopolis, but Duolingo. The language learning app.
Sure.
I declined in my usage of it at one point, and I got a push message saying, "Hey, we're going to stop reminding you because we notice you haven't been on here. If you want us to keep doing so, let us know."
Yep.
And I just thought it was really clever that it was kind of that final nudge and it was we don't want to bother you, but let us know if you want it. And then the last part of empathy, I think, is control, letting the consumers decide what's important. I often point to there's a difference in a message I get from my bank. If my balance falls below a certain amount, I want that immediately on my most intimate device in an urgent format, versus if they're making me a credit card offer, I don't put it in the mail, I might look at it, kind of thing. And so it's understanding what's important to me and communicating with me in a way that makes sense across that.
Agreed. So, where do you think we're going? Will, what's the future of the entitled consumer, and how much, where their expectations are going?
So I think consumers will only become more entitled, right? So
Yeah.
that baseline just continues to go up, and I think that's going to force marketers to change. I think we're going to end up in a post-campaign world. We're going to end up in a world in which trust becomes a brand attribute,
Oh
and I
yeah.
think we're going to end up in a world where products become bespoke. Just this week, we saw McDonald's making a purchase of a technology company to deliver, that specializes in customization of products. One of our best case studies in the book is Indochino, which does customized products. I think that's where the world is going to go because we all want things on our terms.
Dave, you reside just a few miles from the beaches of Florida. I have to ask you, what is your favorite kind of shark and why? It's an
So
obvious
I would
question to go
say
from
it
entitled
is,
consumer to an entitled shark.
right? Well, I'm a scuba diver, and
Yeah,
part of my entitlement is I expect to see sharks when I go to the
exactly. Well,
water,
they're
right? So,
there. You may not see them,
um,
but they always see you.
right. My son on his checkout dive, so he's 14. He got certified a couple of years ago. On his checkout dive, we saw nurse, lemon, and bull sharks
No,
on the same
not bad.
last dive. My favorite would probably be hammerhead, and I think
Yeah.
it's partly the distinctive sort of nature of them. Your heart skips that extra beat when you see one of those coming
Hmm.
towards you when you're 30 or 60 feet under the
Oh
water.
yeah, and they're just so damn big.
Yeah,
So, well, Dave, it's that special time in the show. Are you ready for the 5 most important and interesting questions you're going to be asked today?
we shall find out over the next five
There
questions.
you
But
go.
uh,
So, number one, marketing or customer experience? Dramatic
mm,
pause.
yeah, I'm going to say customer experience, but not necessarily the way it is manifested today. Ultimately, we're trying to get to the right customer experience. I think the challenge is that sometimes that becomes about voice of the customer programs and journey maps and not the customer experience.
Agreed. Number two, scuba or snorkel?
Scuba.
Yeah. But either one would have been an acceptable answer.
Getting wet is good, right? And
Exactly.
some colors and everything else are closer to the surface.
In the
But
water with sharks, and I'm good. So, number
yeah,
three, Notre Dame or the National University of Ireland, Galway, your alma mater.
and I go away.
It was going to be hard
So,
to get a wrong answer out of that for an Irishman. So,
so I'm a peaceful Irish, not a fighting Irish.
there you go. Number four, Joe Montana or the author of your forward for the book, Steve Young.
Well, I have to say Steve Young.
Yeah, how did you get
It's
Steve Young to write
gracious in
the
that.
forward?
I can't tell you that. No, I'm kidding.
Yeah.
Steve is so Steve is a fascinating person to
Oh,
talk to,
absolutely.
and just a really really smart guy, who when you're speaking to him is a little frustrated at the fact that he's better known as a
Yeah,
NFL Hall of Fame
he's accomplished a lot in business afterwards.
but he's done a ton in business afterwards, and he
Yeah,
actually started that while he was still playing. And so he is a founding principal of a private equity firm called HGGC,
hmm,
and HGGC was the primary investor in Celigent, Marketing Cloud, where I had worked. So at every board meeting or most board meetings, Steve would be there, and that's how we got to know him. And he had told us a variant of the story that is the forward about him sort of making those mistakes. And he
yeah.
actually spoke at our customer conferences and told a similar variant of that story too. And so when we went to him and asked him to write it, he was like, "What do I know about this stuff?" And we sort of convinced him that it related, and he was gracious enough to come through on that. So what's interesting is he's also a very entertaining guy, and part of his anecdotes when he's talking is when he references the interceptions that he throws. One of his side comments is always the crowd yelling, "You're not Joe. We want Joe back." And so
Yeah,
he's quite self-deprecating too, which again, as an Irishman, I appreciate.
I bet. So, in the most important question that you're going to be asked today, which ironically is not about Irish whiskey, something we could both talk about, but most
Or
important
Guinness,
you're going to
right?
be question, most important question you're going to be asked today is biscuits or cornbread.
So now I know you know your Irish culture well enough, and biscuits for us are what you call cookies,
Yep.
right? So
Well, you're in the
I'm
you're in the South, even though you're in southern
assuming you're
Florida, still counts. Think
so
of
if I'm
the
not allowed to
gravy
say,
biscuits.
Irish brown bread, which would be where I would probably prefer to go, I've never enjoyed cornbread. I was fascinated by, I don't remember who it was. You had somebody on who sort of did a two by two matrix on all of this as well, and I was like, maybe I've just never had the really good. So I would probably say biscuit, although to be honest, I'm not a huge fan of it either. I'd go with the cookie or the brown bread.
Nice. So, Dave, where do people find out more about you? Get a copy of the book if they're not walking through the same airport I was in, and find out more of
Hopefully, it's
about
more
your.
than one airport, right?
Yeah, well, there's more than one airport, and there's on a lot of different channels. But where do they find out more about you? And also to the rest of the listeners, we are going to be giving away a copy of the book that get everybody a chance to read it. If you will send an email, I'll add it to the show notes as well, but send an email to Kenneth at asharksperspective.com, and we'll take a random drawing of all the entries and get a copy of the book. But where do people find
And
out more
I'm
about you
happy
and the
to.
book as well?
I'd be delighted to sign that and send it to the person who you
Fantastic.
select.
Fantastic. Even better.
Um, so there's a few different places. I'm on LinkedIn. My name on there is D Frankland. I have to overpronounce the land
Yeah.
because people come back and say they can't find me because they type in Franklin. Um, we don't blog as often as we would like to be very honest, but we do have a blog called entitledconsumer.com, and I'm on Twitter as at dfrankland.
Great. Thank you so much, Dave, for being with us today on A Shark's Perspective.
It's been fun. Thank you, Ken.
So there was my conversation with Dave Frankland, the CEO at Customer Strategy Architects, a speaker and the co-author of Marketing to the Entitled Consumer: How to Turn Unreasonable Expectations into Lasting Relationships. Let's take a look at 3 key takeaways from my conversation with him. First, it's harder now than ever to build and form those durable relationships. Customer expectations, technology, empowerment, how Gens Y and Z are changing things. All of these things are massive shifts. And after all, who do we think we are? We've gotten spoiled, but it's also a light bulb moment for the authors, and it should be for us and for brands. There are different flavors of entitlement, as he explained, but most of us seem to be entitled, and it overlaps with demographics. This isn't just about millennials at all. There isn't an easy way to identify them. His advice is to treat everyone as entitled, and I agree. Second, the pace of entitlement, if you will, is accelerating. Our expectations are rising, and they're rising quickly. He calls it an experience arms race. Think about what the best companies are doing, like Apple, Disney, USAA, and Amazon. Not everything that they do is perfect, but the brand of their experience puts them at a different level with consumers today and their expectations. And I love his comment, you don't compete only with just the companies in your category. You compete with Nordstrom on service, Amazon on convenience, Apple on design, Disney on overall experience, etc. Third, so how does a marketer deal with this? How does a brand? It's tough. We flood the market with noise in advertising and marketing messaging, and then a company's product or service fails to deliver on a single weakest chain in the link, and that can blow it with your customer. It has with me with plenty of brands. And that has created a conflict between marketing and customer experience, as he describes. Rather than swim against it, swim with it and show them all that you're giving them special treatment. Marketing isn't the fix for this. At the C level, brand leaders need to fix their product and service and then let the marketers spread the good word. And to be entered into a chance to win the autographed copy of the book, make sure to send me an email to Kenneth at asharksperspective.com. It's been my privilege to spend this time with you in order to discuss another one of the many components that makes up marketing today. Help every single one of your customers feel special, and join us on the next episode of A Shark's Perspective.